Hello, I just want to talk about this book that I finished reading, which is called The Jakarta Method, and it's written by Vincent Bevins. It's a really well-written and engaging book, which made me read it in around 10 days, I think. But despite being a history book, which takes me longer than philosophy or political science or whatever, but the thing that I would have read it even quicker had it not been so depressing. It's really depressing. It goes into excruciating detail about some of the worst things that the victims and the subjects of this book suffered, and that made me have to put it down a couple of times. But I want to talk about it because I think it's an important book. Well, it starts out by talking about the lead up to Sukarno, the leader of Indonesia, the lead up to his overthrow by the military general Suharto. And so the lead up includes the US and CIA interventions in Greece, Iraq, Guatemala, and alongside, simultaneously with the operations in Indonesia, Cuba, the Bay of Pigs, and Brazil. So Sukarno was targeted by the CIA in an anti-communist crusade, despite not being a communist when they began seeing him as a threat. They targeted him because he was neutral in the Cold War. He and his government became leaders of a third world-centered, non-aligned movement seeking to develop the third world. Of course, Sukarno was mainly, I guess, talking about his own country, Indonesia, but he still held the Bandung Conference, which included half of the UN membership. And so it was becoming a really powerful movement. And the second to Sukarno was Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana. But they were unable to reach their potential with this movement because Washington did not like that Sukarno was uniting the third world. And so they covertly tried to destabilize the economy and plotted, coordinated for a coup with the army leadership. And so eventually this is a very long process of many years. They succeed, and Sukarno is overthrown by Suharto, who was an army leader. What followed and even preceded Sukarno's overthrow, because he lost power kind of over the course of many months, while still technically being president. What followed and preceded his overthrow was an extermination campaign that targeted communists, labor leaders, union members, activists, and feminists. And the feminists were targeted, the women were targeted with sexual violence and were tortured especially harshly. So this included campaigns of false information, such as saying that the communists were plotting a coup on their own. They empowered, armed, and encouraged the fascists and Islamists to commit street violence. And also this campaign included the disappearing of victims rather than executing them, which worked really well, because if your husband, your brother, your friend, or your son, if these people disappear, if your loved ones disappear, then you're going to want to collaborate with the army in the hopes that you can get them back. But if they're executed, you immediately, that's closure, basically, relatively, to a disappearance. So a lot of people didn't rebel because they were afraid of what would happen to their loved ones, because they were not sure whether their loved ones were still alive. This campaign also included the ethnic cleansing of Chinese people from the northern islands in Indonesia, not because of their affiliations to a communist country, but because of their race. And they were identified not just by, their national identity, but through their looks, and also through their culture and their name. There's a character that we'll discuss later a real life person who had to change their name. Hindus were also targeted by the fascists, Islamists, and the army. And so this all happened with the collaboration of the CIA, the US Embassy in Jakarta, and the governments of John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson. JFK was a little bit different from LBJ, but the reason wasn't that he was a humanitarian or a really moral great guy. It's because he was humiliated by the Bay of Pigs invasion, and he distrusted the CIA and kind of held a grudge against them. And so he turned to a different mode of diplomacy that the CIA was not aligned with, and neither were a lot of people in his government. So once Suharto is fully in power, the country becomes a puppet of American and British imperial interests, including access to precious metals and resources. And so the USA got what they wanted. And this led them to exporting this method, the Jakarta method, including the idea of disappearing people rather than executing them, to Central and South America, Africa, Southwest Asia, and other parts of Asia. And so, for example, these the places where the Jakarta method was used include Guatemala, Ghana, where Kwame Nkrumah was the leader, Chile, Thailand, Brazil, and East Timor, which was invaded by Suharto with Nixon's approval. I believe it was Nixon, but it was the president of the United States approved the idea of invading East Timor, where they committed genocide. And that's kind of the point of the book, is making this statement about how the CIA came to construct this method and where they used it. And so eventually, they exported that method to other countries around the world. However, there's another aspect of the book that I really like, which is the inclusion of firsthand testimonies and sort of telling people's story, making these characters, humanizing the victims of the anti-communist crusade, which include Benny, a UN development economist, who was an Indonesian, ethnically Chinese, who had to change his name because, based on his ethnicity and his name, he was assumed to be affiliated with the Communist Party, and so he changed his name, and then they left him alone because they took that as evidence that he was not he was loyal to Indonesian interests. Then there's Francisca, another victim of the Indonesian anti-communist crusade, who was a victim of sexual violence and whose husband was murdered, and they were in prison together, and she had to see his body. She had to sit in the same room as his body, and then was not treated for her medical injuries for a long time. But eventually she got out, and she spoke up about the human rights abuses in Indonesia. And finally, the other story that really impacted me was Carmen, who was a member of the Communist Party of Chile, who was born into conservative reactionary family, and so they clashed a lot. And you know, it's a very human story, but she suffers a lot too, and her husband was murdered. And eventually she became a politician for the Communist Party, and I believe she's still doing that right now. So yeah, a tough book to get through, but it's a really wonderful book, and I do recommend it. And I hope everybody checks it out, I guess, if you see this video.